We are live.
Welcome back, everybody. It's the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. I'm Brian Morgenstern here with Sam Lyman. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button. Follow us on X at MorgensternNJ at Sam Lyman 33. We will be talking a lot about Bitcoin, the race for president, other political issues, and business news, our national debt spiraling out of control. And I went to the All In Podcast Summit at UCLA and heard some of the most interesting talks ever, I think. And we're going to go through all of it. So we have an action-packed episode for you. Sam, where would you like to start?
Right. Much to discuss. Let's start, though, with what is most topical in politics right now, which is the presidential debate that we saw this last week. So on Tuesday, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump interestingly met in person for the first time. I wasn't aware of that. For anyone who was watching the debate, they actually shook hands beforehand, and Kamala Harris introduces herself saying, Kamala Harris. I thought that was funny because I think Donald Trump knows who she is. But then the debate started, and man, it was one of the most memorable debates in recent memory. We had cats and dog memes. We had Kamala Harris making Jim from the Office faces at the audience. We had the moderators jumping in at different times to essentially tag team with Kamala Harris. It amounted to more or less a 3-on-1 ambush on Donald Trump himself. And the debate had interesting reactions from audiences across the country. I think on the left, you had a lot of people saying, oh, this is a slam dunk win for Kamala Harris. On the right, you had some concerns that it maybe wasn't the best night for Donald Trump, but it was still an effective one. But let's start there, Brian. And one quick thing, Brian, I don't know if your cell phone is close to the microphone right now, but we're getting a little bit of reverberation there. Yeah, there we go. But yeah, let's start with that, Brian. What did you make of this debate? What were some of your key takeaways?
Yeah, well, my first takeaway was that this was an embarrassing performance by the moderators. They made it about themselves and less about the candidates. They clearly chose a side, decided to fact check Trump constantly and interrupt and do virtually none of that for Harris. And some of the more egregious comments that she made, I have like a top five. One was again trying to link Trump to Project 2025, which he has numerous times said that is not my agenda, and I'm the candidate. I'm the one running. She kept bringing it up anyway. She said he'd sign a national abortion ban. He has repeatedly said in interviews he would not do that, and he said it again on the debate stage. No comment from the moderators. He referred to notorious comments from the former governor of Virginia that, of course, he did make. And the moderators jumped in and kind of moved the goalposts and said he was wrong instead of allowing the candidates to go back and forth. Harris referred to President Trump's bloodbath comment, which was in relation to the auto industry in the U.S. He actually said energy. He was trying to real time fact check in the moment. He actually said it was about energy. When you look at the clip of his prior comments, it actually related to the auto industry. So he was having to real time fact check Harris on that. She repeated the Charlottesville lie, which when you play the whole clip of President Trump speaking, he of course denounced white supremacists and neo-Nazis, but she again brought that up. Joe Biden also brings that up all the time as his reason for running for president, as absurd as that is. And, there was an issue of gun bans, which Harris has previously supported. And, so they're kind of pushing back on Trump for that, even though he was factually correct. So there was all these really, really blatant falsehoods from the Harris side of the ledger that the moderators went totally unchecked, and yet they just constantly were badgering Trump. So my first takeaway is that the moderators, I think, made Trump somewhat more sympathetic. But then I think you add on the layers of the coverage afterwards, which almost felt pre-written to me that like Harris wins, Harris was amazing. It was like all she had to do was stand there and they would have said she did a great job. It was just really lopsided moderating and then follow on coverage. That was like the first thing I noticed was that this was definitely not a fair fight, and they're definitely not trying to just get the facts out there and let voters decide for themselves. This was a 3-on-1. So definitely not a fair fight. I would say in the aftermath, the coverage afterwards matters. And so this is probably not the greatest night for Trump, but I think this notion that it was like a total blowout and Harris won and Trump was terrible, like I think that's wrong too. It's like so many other things in politics, maybe somewhat of a Rorschach test. Um, we've talked previously about brand loyalty. 85% of voters have kind of picked a side already. So they're probably not that persuadable. Whether the middle of the road voters are going to lean one way or the other, um, who knows? But I do think that the lopsided nature of the moderating um, actually kind of maybe made Trump a little bit more sympathetic just because it was so blatantly unfair. But I don't know. That was the main thing that I noticed, but interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think that the moderation actually ended up backfiring in a lot of ways because after the debate, you had different polls that showed, for example, that voters were actually more inclined to vote for Trump, at least on the issue of economics after the debate than they were before. Leading into the debate, they already strongly favored Trump on the economy, but after the debate, they favored him even more. So that's a good sign in and of itself. Another interesting takeaway from the debate is the decision to do a split screen. So while Trump was talking, you could see Kamala's reactions and vice versa. And I actually don't think that redounds to Kamala's benefit. Dylan, if you would mind bringing up that first link. So, of course, the New York Times ate this up. They thought that they really Yas Queened this and portrayed Kamala as a girl boss, just doing her best work out there during the debate, saying in the debate with Trump, Harris's expressions were a weapon. But were they a weapon, really? As someone who leans right, I was watching this debate and I was seeing the smug expressions that Kamala was making throughout. And all I could think of was the mean girl archetype from high school. You have Kamala Harris here making all these faces, having this condescending demeanor every time Donald Trump opened his mouth, especially when he was calling out Kamala's record. And what she's doing here, I mentioned this at the beginning, is she's acting as Jim from The Office, trying to build some kind of rapport or some kind of connection with the audience, some kind of winking nod that she's saying, isn't this absurd? But on so many different occasions, what Trump was saying was true. And so if you're someone who is right of center, maybe even in the middle, and you're watching Kamala's theatrical reactions to Trump's debate portion here, I actually don't think that works to her benefit. Of course, the people on her side absolutely ate it up, but I find this concerning for another reason, Brian. I often talk about theater kids in politics, and Kamala is the culmination of the theater kid presidency. She's an empty political vessel. There's nothing there. She has no ideological moorings. That's evidenced by the fact that she's flip-flopped on every major policy issue since she really came onto the national political scene back in the late 2010s. So she doesn't really have any underpinning there as far as what her moral stances are. And she will read whatever script is handed to her. And this debate was interesting because even though she didn't have a teleprompter for one of the first times throughout her campaign, every single line she delivered was clearly very closely rehearsed. Reportedly, they even had during debate prep somebody dress up as Donald Trump wearing a boxy suit and a super long tie just to get her into the method acting mode of, okay, I am the candidate for president of the United States. And so I thought it was fascinating to watch just the theater kid in her element during that debate. And I think other theater kids watching this think she did a great job. But for people who are looking for a real authentic candidate, they didn't see it in Kamala Harris during this debate because she's not a real authentic candidate. Kamala Harris is a meme of a meme of a meme. Nobody knows what she really is and what she really stands for. And so that was my big takeaway. Yes, maybe not the best night for Donald Trump, but I don't think this did anywhere near the damage to the Trump campaign as the left wants to believe. And I think that Kamala Harris's condescension was seen by millions of voters across the country. And they have registered that this is not an authentic politician. This is not arguably even an authentic person. It's someone who puts on faces for the camera to try to get clicks, to try to get views, but I don't think that will ultimately get her votes at the ballot box in November.
Well, let me play devil's advocate a little bit, because you and I might live in a little bit of our own echo chamber. um, so, I often refer to the movie Private Parts, which is the Howard Stern biopic, where early in his career, when he was blowing up, his ratings were starting to explode. His producer, played, I believe, by Paul Giamatti in the movie, comes in and says, "Your ratings are off the charts. 40% of your audience loves you because they don't know what you're going to say next. 60% of your audience actually hates you, in part because they don't know what you're going to say next." In politics, you need to get people to vote for you, but it can be even more powerful to get people to vote against your opponent. And so I think the challenge in this debate, where everybody has known Donald Trump, he's been famous for 50 years, and he kind of has that Howard Stern-esque ratings element in that he rates off the charts, but not everybody who watches him all the time really loves him. I think Harris needed to just present herself as a viable alternative so that the voters who really don't like Trump would kind of suck it up and vote for her. And on that measure, maybe she met the bar. Just trying to look at it through the lens of a more neutral observer. She didn't cackle. She didn't. She tried to portray herself as moderate, as a gun owner, as she's now pro fracking, of course, after she was against fracking. She tried to portray Trump as extreme because they're both competing for voters in the middle. So I think that's kind of the way she was coming at it. Maybe it was the method acting approach. I don't know. But I think in terms of that bar of like reintroducing her to the American people, since she's a little bit less of a ubiquitous name and personality than Trump is, maybe that's kind of what they were going for and why they approach it that way. As to, what the voters think, I think you're right. They are still more in favor of Trump than Harris on some of these critical issues because of her background, is much of it that they know about on the economy and immigration, to the biggest issues on voters' minds. And so, especially Trump's last statement in the debate, where he went through and said, if they wanted to fix inflation and the economy and the border, they could have been doing that. She's the vice president. She could have been working more effectively on those issues, and you already know what it was like. You have an A-B comparison between a Trump administration and a Biden-Harris administration. I think that was kind of getting to the heart of the issues, but it was in his closing statement. So I don't know. I just add that little bit of color to the commentary.
Yeah, no, that's helpful color. And you touched, Ryan, on the closing statement that Trump gave. It's a really powerful closing statement. Let's actually play that clip and we'll unpack it.
So she just started by saying she's going to do this, she's going to do that, she's going to do all these wonderful things. Why hasn't she done it? She's been there for 3.5 years. They've had 3.5 years to fix the border. They've had 3.5 years to create jobs and all the things we talked about. Why hasn't she done it? She should leave right now, go down to that beautiful White House, go to the Capitol, get everyone together and do the things you want to do, but you haven't done it and you won't do it because you believe in things that the American people don't believe in. You believe in things like, we're not going to frack. We're not going to take fossil fuel. We're not going to do things that are going to make this country strong, whether you like it or not. Germany tried that, and within 1 year, they were back to building normal energy plants. We're not ready for it. We can't sacrifice our country for the sake of bad vision. But I just ask one.
Right, so pretty powerful closing statement there. And the soundbite that stands out is, why hasn't she done it? Ben Stiller the other day was asked by a reporter why he's supporting Kamala Harris. And Ben Stiller said, oh, because she represents change. She's the candidate of change. She's the candidate who's right there in the White House right now. I don't know how the media has spun up this narrative that she's the candidate of change, that she will bring substantive policy differences to this administration because she is the current administration. So that is mind-boggling in a way, but it was a really powerful ending statement by Donald Trump. She's had the opportunity to do all these things she said she will do, but she hasn't done them yet. So why not? So
And the cognitive dissonance is strong, considering one of her favorite taglines is "We're not going back," meaning she wants to preserve the current policies. So it is quite the manufactured narrative from the media here. Not unusual. I think the Trump world is used to that, but that's what they're up against. They're up against the whole, media machine that is portraying her as a candidate of change, even though she's saying we're not going back. In other words, we're not changing. So hard to reconcile those two notions, but here we are.
yeah, here we are. And I think the debate was a microcosm for the campaign itself in the sense that it's not just Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris, it's Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris and the entire legacy media apparatus. So he feels like an underdog, even though he's been on the national political scene for about 8 years. The truth is, Americans like the underdog. So in a funny way, I think that actually puts him in a more favorable position, at least for independent voters. Brian, after watching this closing statement, though, I watched it and I thought, oh man, if only Trump had drilled down on this messaging throughout the entire debate, he would have won indisputably. Instead of this, though, he was on the defensive because it was 3 against 1. But I'm curious what you think his strategy should be going forward. Do you think he should agree to another debate? Do you think he should tweak any of their campaign messaging in any kind of way? What's your take on the future here?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the way the moderators handled this reminded me of 2012 and Candy Crowley when she had interrupted Mitt Romney and tried to fact check him in real time. And that was, of course, small potatoes compared to what the ABC News moderators did this time. And at that time, I remember saying, especially like heading then into the 2016 campaign, the Republican Party needed to do a better job negotiating terms of a debate to make sure that it's going to be fair. That's all you want. You want the moderators to ask pointed questions and then let the candidates duke it out. That's how a fair debate works. So Trump has said he's not necessarily interested in doing another debate. I would say two things in response to that. One, after the way he was treated in this one, and the way the coverage has been so lopsided and biased and slanted in the aftermath, I understand why the calculus might be, who needs that? Just speak directly to the voters. He's got hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign funds. He can do advertising and directly speak to voters. He can keep doing the long form podcasts that he's been doing. He can do rallies. He can go directly to voters. So maybe that's time better spent for him. I would caveat that with if they could get another debate with more fair terms and fair moderators, he is a good debater. And you think back to President Obama when he was going against Romney, he was lackluster in his first debate. Even he acknowledged he lost that debate. He did very poorly. The more experienced presidential candidate, whether sitting president, typically, or in this case, the former president, sometimes, I would say knock out the Trump-Biden debate for a second because it is a new race, it's a new candidate. Maybe this is like that first Obama debate where he wasn't quite ready. I don't know that Trump wasn't ready, but maybe now he knows better how a moderator would approach it with him versus Harris. And so maybe he can take lessons learned from this one and do better the next time if he can get better terms in a fair debate. If he can't, if the Harris campaign is not going to agree to one moderated by, for example, Brett and Martha at Fox News or something like that, if they're not going to agree to that, then I don't think he should do it. But if he could get a fair shake, it's worth considering. I think those are my thoughts on that, but I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, I agree. There seems to be this admission on the left that there was a lot of bias in this debate, not by everyone, but by reasonable people. And I think a way to balance that out is what you said, doing a debate with Fox News, where he can be assured going into it that it will be more fair, it will be more balanced, as is the Fox News tagline in a lot of ways. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. Switching gears a little bit, let's talk about one topic that wasn't mentioned at all, not even once during the entire debate, even though, in our opinion, it should be a topic that should be top of mind for all office holders across the United States, and that is the national debt. Dylan, can you bring up the national debt clock there? So the national debt has now surpassed $35 trillion. For context, to even count to the number 1 trillion, it would take a human being 30 years to do that. So imagine counting to 35 trillion, what that would take 30 times 30, like 900 years for a human being to even count to that number, which is an insane, mind-boggling, incomprehensibly high number that we can't even grasp as human beings, but that's how much our country is in debt right now. Now, add to this crisis the fact that the interest that we need to pay on the debt has now surpassed defense spending. Dylan, can you bring up that next chart? So this is a really alarming statistic right here. As you can see in this graph, just the amount of debt that we need to pay off from U.S. interests is skyrocketing right now, and it is projected to continue at this astronomically high rate of interest payments. So by the year 2030, the amount of interest that we'll need to pay on our debt will reach $3 trillion. So Ryan, this is something that you've been ringing the alarm on for a really long time now. Can you break all this down for us in layman's terms and why this is such a big deal?
Sure. So a couple of stats I've pointed out, and on that, the debt clock graphic that Dylan showed, if you scroll down that page just a little bit, you see the largest budget items: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, and interest on the debt. If you add those up, they total more than $5 trillion. We are taking in about 4.9 trillion in tax revenue. So only those four categories would have us running a deficit. That's why our deficit is $2 trillion, like 40% of the amount of revenue we're taking in. We are in a debt spiral. It is not a tax revenue problem. You cannot tax your way out of that. You need economic growth and you need budgetary cuts. So it's in a kind of a spiral at this point. It's, politicians often get elected by promising to give people things, not take things away. And when you can print money, that's what gets you into this kind of situation. In the 70s, President Nixon got away from the gold standard. We depegged the dollar from assets. If we don't have some course correction here, we are headed for constant high inflation. We're headed for higher taxes and lower growth, and things will get much worse. We need to make maybe some unpopular decisions. It'll be unpopular in the short term, but there would lead to a much stronger economy in the long term. So we need politicians to get things right over the next 4 years, or else we are headed down a really, really dangerous path right now. Again, it's those four budget lines alone are more than the tax revenue we're taking in. So you could eliminate all the rest of the government and we would still have a deficit. This should be scary for anybody who has ever balanced a budget. If you see something like that, you're really, really in trouble. So it's not the sexiest issue. People don't necessarily feel it in their daily lives aside from inflation or their taxes. But those are two really, really key things, and they're totally intertwined. So trying to get the American people to understand that, I think, is a critically important job, but a difficult one. And I'm hopeful that it's starting to break through now, maybe more so now than ever before, but it's still, the national debt didn't even come up in the debate. Really kind of shocking. and troubling. But we are where we are. We need to cut spending for sure. And we can get into this a little bit later, but Trump has agreed with Elon Musk that he might take Elon's offer to work on a government efficiency commission to try to start to correct this ship. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's one of the things that really does need to happen at this point.
Yeah. Just to provide a little more context for people, what all these charts mean is that we're fast approaching a point where to pay off much of our debt that is a result of excessive money printing, we'll have to print more money. And at that point, we reach what can only be described as a debt death spiral. So we're in a really precarious position here where our debt is becoming uncontrollable. And that's what's so fascinating to me, Brian, is that in many ways, a country that can't fix its finances, that can't get out of debt, that finds itself in this kind of position, that's an existential threat to the country itself. And yet there was no mention of it in the debate whatsoever. And you mentioned that, it's not the sexiest topic. Even so, it's a critically important one. Why is it that you think that this didn't come up during the debate on Tuesday? And why do you think it hasn't been a topic that's at the forefront of both campaigns?
Well, a couple of reasons. One, it's definitely not good for the Harris campaign because she's been touting things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which was one of the more comically named pieces of legislation ever since it caused exploding inflation. And her policy prescriptions, the Biden administration and presumably her administration would be advocating for more spending from the public fisc, not less. So it's definitely not, the cynical answer is that it's not very good for Harris. But, President Trump has spent a lot as well during his term. So I don't know that he would have, he's talked about the Efficiency Commission. He's talked about wanting to spur more growth. And he's talked about, more energy production, all of which could help with spurring more growth and decreasing the debt. So he would have some answers to that, but it's not something that he loves talking about because he wants to talk about things that are more directly related, I think, to voters' lives. He's talking about no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security, no taxes on overtime for working people. So he's talking about more things that people can feel and relate to more easily. So I guess I say that by way. I guess my main point is that neither campaign is dying to talk about the debt because they think that there are other issues that are more top of mind for voters. But hopefully going forward, it will become more top of mind for voters as they start to realize how related it is to their cost of living and their tax bills.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll reach a point where it'll be impossible for voters and politicians to ignore anymore because there will be real life consequences that we maybe haven't seen in full yet, but we will soon. Who knows exactly when that timeline is. But this, of course, is a Bitcoin-centric podcast. And, it's really interesting to compare and contrast the Bitcoin monetary policy with the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve, which is largely responsible for leading us into this crisis. Brian, what do you make of the Bitcoin angle? How does Bitcoin relate to this discussion about the national debt, money printing, a death spiral? How can we tie Bitcoin into all of the above?
Well, people need to protect themselves against inflation and the runaway debt spiral. And the best performing asset of the last decade is Bitcoin. Gold has performed well. Equities and the stock market have performed pretty well. Real estate has performed pretty well. So hard assets, and the fact that Bitcoin is scarce and it is the most scarce sound money in digital form that has ever existed, it really is kind of the hard asset of the future that people can use to protect themselves against what the government is doing. So I think it's critically important. That's why you're seeing more and more Americans add it to their portfolio. You're seeing pension funds. You're seeing, you know, sovereign nations like El Salvador putting it on their balance sheet. We just saw Russia, President Putin talk about how Russia is going to be a leader in Bitcoin mining now. And they've mined, I think it was 54,000 Bitcoin that I saw. And they've legalized mining and Bitcoin transactions. I think people all around the world are seeing what's going on with national debts, and they're starting to realize maybe we do need some sound money, hard assets in our portfolios to deal with this debt spiral and to help protect themselves. So I think that that's how it all relates in my mind. But curious to hear if you have any other clever ways of talking about it.
Yeah, no, what you said reminds me of the fact that we did leave the gold standard back in the early 1970s, and yet we continue to accumulate gold. And so we depeg the dollar from gold, yet the Federal Reserve still holds vast amounts of gold. The United States government has a lot of gold on its balance sheet. Russia, China, countries across the world are accumulating gold at faster rates now than they have in years. And so what I find interesting about this behavior from the governments, they're saying, don't look at what we say, look at what we do. And so what governments say is that fiat currency has value, essentially because the governments say it has value. But there's almost this tacit admission on the part of the United States and other central banks across the world that maybe this fiat currency is not as strong as we hold it up to be. And that tacit admission can be seen by the fact that countries continue to accumulate gold. And so one thing we've talked about a lot on this podcast is the idea of a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And we have to get creative in addressing the issue of our national debt, because simply cutting taxes and cutting entitlements, I don't think is going to do it. I think we need to find more unconventional ways of potentially paying off our debt. And one of those ways would be a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Senator Cynthia Lummis herself has said that if we were to create a Bitcoin strategic reserve, it would have the potential of paying off half of our national debt. So there's things we can do here outside of what we've usually turned to in moments of economic and fiscal crisis like this, where we can potentially address the underlying issues here. And I think Bitcoin for our nation state and other nation states is a really good way to return to reality, return to the idea of sound money, and to help us get back on track economically. So that's just one idea from my end. Brian, any other thoughts on this, or do you want to move on to the next topic, Bitcoin Democrats?
Yeah, I think we covered it pretty well. Countries, I'll just say this, countries can kind of shore up their balance sheets in a number of ways. Various currencies, gold, obviously, a lot of countries own, strategic oil reserves because energy prices are so important in terms of growth and inflation. Canada has their strategic maple syrup reserve. I think a strategic Bitcoin reserve is a smart way for everybody to have stronger balance sheets. So it does make sense for individuals, pension funds, these large financial institutions, and yes, governments, to make them more resilient in the future, which they definitely need, given what we're seeing in terms of the finances. So agree with all that. And yeah, at this point, we probably beat the dead horse a little bit, but I think it's an important horse to be beating, though.
Yeah, exactly. So the only thing harder than getting politicians to care about the national debt is getting them to recognize the importance of Bitcoin and the potential role it can play in helping address this issue. However, this last week, we made some important progress on this front in reaching out to Democratic legislators in the House of Representatives. So this last week, we held a roundtable with about 8 Democratic members of the House. And this roundtable was chaired by Congressman Wiley Nickel, who's been very forward thinking on crypto issues really since day one. He is what I would describe as a blue dog Democrat. That term itself is almost going extinct because blue dog Democrats themselves are going extinct. There's not many of them anymore, but he is a business friendly, very reasonable, very, I would even argue, fiscally conservative Democrat. And he has recognized for a long time the role that crypto can play in our economy. And so he brought with him 7 of his fellow colleagues from the House Democratic Caucus, and they met with several of us from the Bitcoin industry to talk about Bitcoin mining, its relationship with the grid, its role in strengthening American national security, its role in helping financial inclusion, helping boost financial inclusion for minorities and the unbanked. And it was a really productive meeting. It was a reminder to me that Bitcoin is truly bipartisan. The only thing that prevents it from being bipartisan is oftentimes a lack of education. Of course, there will always be people on the left who will disagree with the whole idea of Bitcoin because it entails removing power from the government, disintermediating the government for money to a certain extent. Even so, there's a lot of Democrats who, to their credit, recognize that Bitcoin plays an important role in giving people financial autonomy and helping people own their own self-bearing assets. So it was a productive meeting, and we had a really fruitful discussion. Brian, I'm going to ask you, though, to put on your Bitcoin Voter Project hat for this next question. You know, you've met with a lot of Democratic legislators over the years, and a big part of the Bitcoin Voter Project's mission is to help lawmakers and policymakers recognize the importance of Bitcoin as a policy issue. So when you speak to Democrats, whether in the House or in the Senate, how do you help them understand the critical importance of Bitcoin as a policy issue?
Well, different audiences have different policy priorities. So oftentimes on the left, there will be concerns with environment and how energy use can increase emissions or things like that. And I typically explain how Bitcoin is a flexible energy load that can help monetize stranded assets, often wind power or solar power that is not yet able to be stored and deployed at key times when demand is highest. So until we have better batteries, we need virtual batteries like Bitcoin mining that can provide the customer and the potentially, in some instances, co-investor to get more sustainable sources off the ground. Also, one example I frequently use is Congressman Richie Torres from the Bronx. He's been very pro Bitcoin and pro digital assets for a long time. He has constituents that will often do cross-border transactions because they have family members in different countries. And Bitcoin is the fastest, cheapest, most secure way for them to be transmitting value across borders. And people who typically distrust legacy institutions like banks, maybe they've been debanked, maybe they've had a bad experience with a loan or something like that. And they want more financial autonomy. They want to be able to control their own assets, custody their own assets, and not wait for permission from the government or permission from a bank. It's good for inclusion. It's good for the environment. Oftentimes, if we're talking about, well, really anybody, because it cuts across the political spectrum, but people who are worried about a central bank digital currency and the government having more power of surveillance and control over the population, Bitcoin is the opposite of that. It allows individuals to interact with each other financially on a peer-to-peer basis, and so it can kind of be a bulwark against, government surveillance and control. So there's a variety of things that we can talk about. Also on the energy side, if you like clean natural gas, Bitcoin miners can also help spur the development of more nat gas energy, which is dispatchable really at any time that it's needed. But Bitcoiners will use it when it's cheap and abundant. They can make it available if power is scarce and it's needed elsewhere. So, I mean, it's got all these different uses that make life better for everybody, no matter where you are. So it sometimes just depends on the audience you're talking to as to which points you want to emphasize, because they might resonate a little bit more. But we can go into all of these topics. It just depends on who we're talking to. And we want everybody to support Bitcoin. Bitcoin is nonpartisan. It doesn't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. It's just technology. So just trying to keep it bipartisan, because the last thing we want is for this ecosystem to depend on who wins the next election. We want everybody to be a Bitcoiner. So anybody who wants to learn about it, we will go and talk to them. And we want it to be a nonpartisan or bipartisan issue 100% going forward.
Yeah. And to that end, I think it's important to help people recognize that Bitcoin crosses party lines, especially among constituents. We actually have some interesting data that shows that, an equal amount of Republicans and Democrats own Bitcoin and digital assets. There's actually this really good clip that we saw on Bloomberg this last week that helps kind of explain this idea that I'm getting at. Do you mind playing that, Dylan?
And the vast majority of crypto owners in the U.S., according to you guys, plan to consider a candidate's digital asset policies when they vote for the next president. 73%. What does consider mean, though? Does it mean a top issue, or it's just in the back of their head?
I do not think it's single issue, right? It's just consider. So what we found in our State of Crypto report is that 3/4 of U.S. crypto holders are considering policies for when they go to the ballot box this fall. So really interesting. I don't think it's single issue. I think that's part of their overall decision.
Number there, 3/4 of voters, crypto voters, consider digital assets as a key issue at the ballot box this November. And Brian, you've been beating this drum for a long time here, but I think it just goes to show that this truly is an issue that cuts across party lines, and it'll be an issue that's big at the ballot box this year. And I would argue every year after this, it will only become an issue of growing importance as it becomes a bigger asset in people's financial portfolios.
Yeah, and the Bitcoin Voter Project's really critically important because it does cut across partisan lines. The data we have shows that it's actually slightly more Democrats than Republicans, and a lot of people who are in the middle. It's people who haven't developed that brand loyalty to one party or another. These people are not addicted to cable news. They haven't been infected by whatever mind virus, the woke mind virus, or whatever the opposite of that is. They really do. They want to vote their pocketbook. They think that Bitcoin and other digital asset technologies are the future, that they're going to empower them. And so they're paying very close attention. And in an election where it could be, like the last several, decided by 70 or 80,000 voters across a few states, there are far more than enough voters who are plugged in on Bitcoin and digital assets who are going to make their decision potentially based on a candidate's position on Bitcoin. So we want to make sure those voters have their voices heard, that they are educated, and that they are activated. And that's what the Bitcoin Voter Project is all about. So again, I'll give this a plug, bitcoinvoterproject.org, on Twitter at Bitcoin Voter, on Facebook at Bitcoin Voter Project, on Instagram at Bitcoin Voter, we're on TikTok, we're everywhere, just trying to reach those voters and make sure that they know we're sticking up for them and we want their voices heard in this election, and we're going to help them make their voices heard in the policy debates that follow. As different regulations or pieces of legislation come up, we're going to help them call their congressman, call their legislator, and make sure that our elected representatives are keeping in mind the opinion of their constituents. And this is a voting block of millions of people who care deeply about these issues. So very excited about this project and helping to get people out and making their voices heard.
Yeah, a lot of exciting news happening on that front. So Brian, to close this out today, we got to talk about the All In Summit. I think the All In Summit is probably the biggest convention of techno optimists in the country. A lot of exciting things seem to come out of that summit every year. And I know that you had the chance to go this last week. Let's unpack that. What were your biggest takeaways? Who were the speakers? What were some of the most interesting topics? I would love to hear more about your experience there.
So for people who haven't watched it or listened to it, the All In podcast is for techno optimists in Silicon Valley. David Sachs, Chamath Palihapitiya, Jason Calacanis, and David Friedberg. They are four of the smartest guys around, and they hosted this summit with one of the most legendary speaker lists I think I've ever seen at any conference ever. And they led it off with Senator J.D. Vance, of course, running for vice president. He sat for very tough questions. He was very happy to take them and answer them. He was followed by Senator Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, who regaled the audience with a number of stories, including the toughest and most important vote of her career to protect the filibuster in the Senate and preserve some semblance of bipartisanship. We heard from Elon Musk, which actually, Dylan, you can put up the tweet about there it is, Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, referring to, of course, Dogecoin, which he started sort of as a meme. He talked about a lot of topics. One of them was how regulation is killing innovation and economic growth in America. He talked about how at SpaceX, they're building rockets. He wants to land on the moon and he wants to land on Mars. And he's pointed out that getting the paperwork approved, the regulatory paperwork approved, can actually take longer than building a rocket that can go to outer space. Something is out of balance there. He also talked about this idea of him leading a government efficiency commission. Two main points he touched on there. One is the need to cut regulations and make sure that innovators don't have paperwork getting in the way of creating growth in America. The other piece was decreasing the size and scope of government, the amount that it's spending on headcount, and shifting people from the government payroll to the private sector payroll. It'll take a number of years to do it, but it's something that absolutely has to happen given our first discussion or earlier discussion on the national debt. They had Megyn Kelly, who drove an absolute Mack truck through the lawfare that has been launched against President Trump. They had Bari Weiss talking about cancel culture and sort of echo chambers. One really interesting point that she made was about how the New York Times readership is like some astronomical percentage, like 98% or something of their readership would characterize themselves as liberal or progressive, and that they all generally come from the writers, and the editors will often come from kind of the same echo chambers, the same groupthink environments of universities and schools and urban environments, which is, of course, the number one determiner of partisanship in America. So she went deep on those issues, really, really important. We had Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer, two very lauded professors, talk about global power dynamics and whether money or power or other interests generally motivate people in the context of, for example, the Ukraine war or the Israel-Gaza conflict. They had the former CEO of Uber, Travis, who talked about his experience building and then getting ousted from his obviously very famous and valuable company, and what he's doing now, creating the Uber for restaurants, where he'll buy these enormous facilities, build like 30 commercial kitchens, and then have renowned chefs come in and assemble meals that are then put together by robots and shipped out en masse to the population. Fascinating stuff. A gentleman, Juan Carlos Izpizua Belmonte, he's a researcher at, I believe it's UC San Diego. Forgive me if I mess that up, but he talked about how he discovered essentially the ability to de-age diseased cells. And this could have implications for all kinds of diseases and expand human life expectancy as we know it. And then Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, very famous billionaire businessman, came and talked about AI and what Salesforce is doing with AI, which is really fascinating. But he also talked about, related back to that cell de-aging process, and how he had an Achilles tendon problem, and they're basically able to build him a new Achilles tendon using this technology. Really fascinating stuff. There was an entrepreneur who created a robot in his dorm room and now runs a multi-billion-dollar company whose robots are repairing everything from the Brooklyn Bridge to aircraft carriers and oil tankers, you name it, totally expanding the resilience of critical infrastructure. We had astronaut Woody Hoberg, who's just back from the International Space Station, talk about how he's planning a mission to the moon as a staging ground for a mission to Mars. I mean, this conference expanded the mind more than I think anything I have ever attended, and really helped me appreciate what is possible with us humans, what we can do. it is really the sky's the limit, and it was an incredibly inspiring and very fun conference. So I know it's hard to get into those, but this was just mind-blowing speaker after mind-blowing speaker. Oh, Peter Thiel spoke about business, about global politics, about electoral politics. It was from beginning to end one of the most interesting experiences ever. I cannot believe these guys were able to cram so much just into a few days. I would accept their sponsorship anytime to promote their stuff, what they're doing, because this was just an absolutely crazy conference. The parties were great. The themes were Top Gun and beach volleyball and Back to the Future in the 80s. So I put on my best Maverick Goose 2024 campaign t-shirt, and then I had my prized possession, my Peter Venkman uniform shirt from Ghostbusters that I was able to trot out for this. So it was just a rousing success all along. Super, super fun, really, really interesting time.
Yeah, I'm just glad you wore a shirt to the Top Gun volleyball party.
I'm not in Tom Cruise 1980s shape these days. Maybe I'll get back to that, but I needed to spare the audience from that imagery.
Yeah, that sounds awesome though. And I think it harkens back to a time in American history when people were optimistic. I mean, the 80s, I wasn't even alive yet. I was born after the 80s, right? But I look back at it nostalgically somehow just because I've watched all the movies from the 80s growing up. My parents were in college during the 80s. I've long loved Ronald Reagan, and just it seemed to be the time when optimism in America was at a peak, when, as Ronald Reagan himself said, it was morning in America. And I think the All In podcast and the techno optimist movement as a whole is tapping into that again, to that idea of American optimism. And, Brian, it's so interesting, the list of speakers that you mentioned, because you mentioned Kyrsten Sinema. Of course, there's Jason Calacanis, who's one of the hosts of the All In podcast. You mentioned Bari Weiss. So those three people in particular are people who are either still Democrats or identify as progressive or did at one time, but they've tapped into something that seems to transcend political parties, which is this idea that the default answer for how can we improve human society shouldn't be government. In fact, I think in many cases that should be the last answer. Perhaps the default answer should be technology. And I think that idea that technology can help us overcome so many of the problems that we face today, I think that is a movement that transcends typical political boundaries of right and left. And as a political movement, the first person who translates techno-optimism into a political agenda, I think will be a world-changing political figure. And you're starting to see that slowly take hold in different political campaigns even now. I think what most separates Donald Trump's campaign now from his campaigns in 2020 and 2016 is that new alliance with Silicon Valley business leaders who have embraced these ideals of techno-optimism. And I actually think the Republican Party could become the home of the techno-optimist movement. It's telling as well that Chamath himself has come around to Donald Trump in this last go round, and I think gone so far as to endorse him. That I think will be the biggest game changer in politics over the next decade, is that whereas the Republican Party has been looked to as at one time the party of country club elites, and at another time as the party of social conservative values, I think what will become the dominant theme in Republican Party politics over the next decade is this idea of techno-optimism, this idea of we should believe in the future. We should believe that we can go to Mars. We should believe that we can explore the stars, that we can defeat aging, that we can defeat cancer. There's so much positivity that emanates just from these podcasts and from these YouTube clips alone that I can only imagine what it would have been like to be there in person. Yeah, Brian, any thoughts on that front?
Well, yeah, I mean, these technologies can preserve free speech. They can prevent censorship. They can create much a more efficient economy and faster growth, which is going to help us not just provide for people's well-being, both through private sector economic activity, but through having a stronger safety net. it can solve, it can make wars less likely and less deadly. It has the potential to solve so many different problems in our society. And that was really a key theme here. And it cut totally across partisan lines. So, it led to a whole lot of optimism that we don't have to be all doom and gloom all the time. People out there are doing amazing things. So, for once, we don't have to end our pod talking about some daunting challenge before all of us, but talk about, yes, we do have a lot of challenges. There's also a lot of amazing people out there developing solutions, and it's really, really inspiring.
100%. And it's always good to go out on a positive note. On an even more positive note, Brian, we have a special guest next week. Do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. Yes. Tune into the pod, and we'll start promoting this soon. On Tuesday at 10 a.m., we are talking to House Republican whip, the majority whip of the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Tom Emmer. And he is one of the members who is the most plugged in on Bitcoin, on business, on politics. And we want to get his thoughts on what the government has been doing with respect to these things, what it needs to do, and what are the prospects politically. We're going to dive into some of the legislation that he's sponsored and figure out what the prospects are of some good bills passing or bad bills passing. But we'll dive into all kinds of different details, some of the friends that we have in common, and how we got to talk to him in the first place. So it's going to be a really fun, engaging conversation. Send us your questions on social media. Let us know what you want to hear Whip Emmer discuss, and we will be honored and privileged to have him here.
Yeah, our first guest on the pod. Really exciting stuff. So we covered a lot of topics today, Brian. Anything else before we close out?
I don't think so. This is a fun one. Lots of good stuff happening. We'll obviously keep our eyes glued to the election and what's happening with that. But it's going to be a very fun, very exciting few months ahead. And thanks everybody for joining us. Again, hit that like and subscribe. Follow us on X at MorganSternNJ, at Sam Lyman 33. And we will see you next time on the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod.